And now we welcome our last speaker before the final panel. Ali Shah is going to talk about AI for society. A warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for persevering. We're nearly there. It's nearly the end. And soon after the panel, you'll be able to go out and enjoy the sunshine. Also, thanks to Ida, to Thorold, Anders, and the Catapult family for putting this on and giving us the space to have this conversation. I just want you to take a few seconds to think about what brought you to this moment in space, this moment in time. I don't mean whether you came on a plane or a train, or you live around the corner, or you crossed an ocean, but what were all of the different things that had to line up perfectly for you to arrive here? And who were all of the different people who had to support you in your journey so you could be part of this new family that we're all part of now at Catapult? Let's just take a couple of seconds to think about that. And if you've got their faces in mind, I'd like you just to now give a silent thank you as well. Just let's take a second just to give a silent thank you to all of them. I want to tell you a story about the person, one of the people I want to give thanks to, which is my father. So my dad, his name was Shah. He died 25 years ago. And the end of April marked the anniversary of his death. And for the last 25 years, every year on the days of his death, his friends and his family, we all get together and we all share his stories and celebrate his life. And typically, about 200 people turn up. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. But they all come along, and what I've found is that almost every single year, I learn something new about him. So I learned that he, by the way, he's the one who's leaning forward on that picture on the left. He was from Pakistan, from a village in Pakistan, from a respected family, but very poor. He didn't get much access to education. There was no running water in the village that he was in, so they had to go to the well. Home was no more than a couple of rooms, mud brick rooms. And his father died when he was fairly young as well. And he and his brothers had to provide for their mum. And then as he got a little bit older and he got married to my mum, he had to provide for his family. And he did what many people do when they don't have much education, but they have to find some meaning, some way of sustaining their families and meaning in life. He joined the Pakistani army. So he spent some time in the Pakistani army trying to provide for his family and trying to do something that was civically minded. But that wasn't his calling. And so there was a moment in the UK. So in the 60s, the UK was suffering a productivity crisis. The consumer demand of the output of the factories, whether it was cotton or steel or whatever it might be, far outstripped the amount of workers that the factory owners needed and industry needed to be able to sustain that consumer demand. And so the UK opened its borders, put out the invites to the Caribbean, to South Asia, the Far East, and said, come to us, come to the UK, and we can give you jobs, we can give you meaning, we can give you sustenance, we can allow you to provide for your family. My dad came over, and he was a manual metal worker in an engineering factory in Sheffield called Laycock & Sons. Just as a quick aside, Laycock & Sons now, the factory's no longer there, but they've turned it into apartments and like this cool rework type space. Just like it's weird what happens with industry. But again, that wasn't his calling. And productivity, the crisis ended, consumer demand dropped, the factory owners had to decide what to do with their workers, they had to let some go. My dad was one of those who had to be let go, and he moved on, he found another job. And he became a bus conductor. Now, how many people even know what a bus conductor does? We've automated that job away. Do you all know? If you don't, it was one of those roles where a person would be on a bus where you would get on, and in the 60s and 70s when he was doing this work, you would pay them a few pennies, and they would issue you a paper ticket, and that was your permission to ride on that bus. That job's disappeared now, it doesn't exist. And something really amazing happened to him, and then he met two people, just a chance meeting, Adrian and Bernadette, this couple. They became lifelong friends. It was almost like a love affair between the couple and my dad. Like they just found him charismatic and engaging, and he them in turn. And they said to him, you look so much like Omar Sharif, and in fact, we think you have not only the looks, but you have the charisma and the intelligence, that spark. We want to arrange a screen test for you. So they arranged a screen test at Pinewood Studios in the UK. And I don't know if you know Pinewood's history, but Pinewood was seminal in creative industries, right? Where Bond films were made, lots of Hollywood blockbusters were made, and they said, come on, let's make sure we get you this screen test. So screen test was a really coveted opportunity for anybody who was trying to break into the creative industries. But my dad didn't take it. He didn't go for the screen test. And when I heard this a couple of weeks ago, when all of his friends were gathering and they're telling this story that I hadn't heard before, it made me sort of start to really reflect about why was that? Was it because he loved his job being a bus conductor? Not at all, because soon after he moved on and started his own business working in a restaurant. It started to make me ask myself, what was his freedom to choose, right? So he needed to provide for his family. By then he had some kids. My mom had some kids. He had to pay his taxes, pay his bills. What were the different factors that maybe meant that it was not right for him to take that screen test? One of those could have been he didn't want to do it. Maybe he didn't want to become a movie star or an actor. That is legitimately a possibility. But I wonder what all of those other factors were that limited his opportunity space, the things that he could do. And I was reminded of that by a person a few weeks ago called Hilary Cottam. She reminded me that the BBC had done some work on this. So back in, I should explain, I'm from the BBC. Back in 2011, the BBC did the largest survey of UK society ever conducted, ever. 161,400 people responded to this very detailed survey of what was happening in UK society. There was a companion survey done by GfK, and the analysis, academic analysis, was done by Professor Savage and a whole bunch of academics. He's from London School of Economics, but a whole range of universities came along to analyze that data. If you want to look into that data yourself, or if you want to read that paper, just search for BBC 2011 Great British Class Survey, and you can find that data, or just search on Google Scholar. And when they had all of this information, this deep profile of what was happening in UK society, the academics needed a framework to try and judge, well, how will we judge what unites society and what divides society, what the stratification is? And so they decided to build on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and Pierre, if you know him, talks about the different forms of capital that make us who we are. And so they settled on using economic, social, and cultural capital as the different ways to try and judge where we all fit, who we are, where we belong. And what they found was that UK society is separated in these different strata, but I don't think this is just particular to the UK. Every community, every country, globally, the balance might be slightly different, but there is a stratification going on. For the lowest in society, what low means is that they have the lowest access to economic, social, and cultural capital. The highest in society, the elites, have the highest access to economic, social, and cultural capital. But what gets you there? So some of the results that came through were really interesting to me. Right? First one is, even if you have the aptitude, even if you have the capability, by God, it helps if your family's already there. Because if they're not, you're going to find it really a struggle to become an elite. So it helps if your family are already an elite or nearly in the elite status in society. It helps that they already have access to economic, social, and cultural capital. If you're not part of that group already, or your family's not part of that group already, your chances in life have already become much more limited, and you're going to have to struggle even harder. What also shocked me was that only 4% of ethnic minorities, and I'm an ethnic minority, belong to the elite group. Just another sort of quote or statistic from the Social Mobility Commission's report in 2016. I'm going to read this out and just ponder on this, please. A well-paid job in a professional profession, a well-paid job in a top profession is still strongly correlated with social background. Children from working class backgrounds, even if they are high attainers, are less likely to secure such jobs because they have less access to networks and knowledge to navigate the system than their more affluent peers. What that's telling us is that unless you know how to navigate the corridors of power, unless you have the social network to help you work your way through the systems, your chances in life are going to be much more reduced, much more difficult. So What's the equation for life then? What determines how you arrived in this room, how children around the world, where they will end up? The equation for life, it seems, is, well, where you start in life, where you were born, who your family were, who you know, the networks you have access to, the people who can help you along, multiplied by a degree of luck. And if you're an outlier, if you've broken through, if you got through, well, you probably needed a great deal of luck. Is that fair? Is that just? Do we think that's the sort of society that we want? And this is just, the data was just from the UK. Imagine if that stratification is like it is in the UK, what it was like, or what it is like globally, the inequality that we see. And a large part of that, I believe, is due to the fact that we place emphasis on different forms of capital in different ways. And a large part of our society is really singularly focused around economic capital as the main driver, the main incentive for what we achieve in life. But that's not who we are. A large proportion of what we believe in has to span all the different forms of capital that make us who we are. You might be asking by this stage, well, the talk was about AI and society and what it might take for us to flourish. So how does this link in? Well, the first thing is that AI is not something that's going to happen. It's something that's happening. Machine learning is already being used to try and determine some of the outcomes, some of the ways that you interact with society. We've heard over the last couple of days some great applications, right? So using machine learning to try and solve cancer or treat cancer. This morning, Philippe talked about how machine learning and power of data can be used in Alzheimer's. Chemical, molecular assessment. We just heard about how machine learning and AI can be used in teaching and learning. Some great applications, but equally, our lives now are the petri dish for these experiments. They're being done on a grand scale. The sort of profiling data that's being used is building a picture of society at a level that we've never had before. That survey in 2011 by the BBC, the largest ever, 161,400 people surveyed, that's child's play for banks, media companies, social media companies, retailers, organizations that are working with machine learning and data. They now have such a deep level of knowledge of who we are that it far outstrips the sorts of detailed knowledge that was asked in that survey questionnaire. But what are we using it for? We're using it to show more ads, recommend another thing, make you buy something else, trying to direct your attention to things that I think we'll look back on in this moment in time. And at best, we'll judge them as trivialities, right? We were missing the bigger picture. We'll just judge the trivial. At worst, we will look back and judge this moment in time as one where we amplified the inequalities in society because we did not use the power of machine learning effectively. And here's some tropes, right? You'll all be familiar with these. Anyone who reads the news. First one, machine learning is going to automate away jobs. Projections from 20 to 30% over the next few years. Often with the caveat that just as many new jobs will be created. If a job is suitable for automation, like my dad's conductor job was, then great, I'm actually a proponent of more automation. That's fantastic. But if we're on this constant cycle of automation, we've got to rethink about what jobs actually mean to all of us, right? So that's the first thing to hold in your heads, I think. What will work actually mean? And if it's driven out of just economic capital, well, that's never going to really be fulfilling for any of us. The second trope is AI as the helper, AI to augment who we are. And we've just had a brilliant example of where that can really positively work, right? So Ben just really talked about in the classroom situation how AI can really support teachers and students in ways that we hadn't imagined before and shift outcomes positively. And again, I'm a positive advocate of AI as the helper, whether it's in the work context or in the personal context. But again, if it's only defined within an economic capital paradigm, the incentives that are being built into that helper, that entity, that agent, that piece of software, are going to be incentivized around economic gains only. But what we saw earlier was that economic gains aren't the only thing that define us. It's the interplay between all of the different forms of capital that makes us who we are. So what's missing? I think if AI has a superpower, it's the power to reflect society back to itself and to amplify our endeavors. But that's the one power that we're not really tapping into effectively. It will reflect back to us the differences that divide us, but also the sorts of characteristics that could unite us. And if there was a new equation for humanity where humanity flourishes, where F is flourishing, what would it look like? I think it has to include artificial intelligence, its power to amplify, but it has to include that balance, that interplay between the economic, cultural, and social capital that is so essential. But there's a piece missing in this equation. It's the agency, the ability for people to define their own outcomes. Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize-winning philosopher and development economist, and I encourage you all to read his work. The more I'm an engineer, the more I get involved in artificial intelligence and developing systems and trying to introduce AI into the BBC and wider, the more I try and read philosophy and what economists and social scientists are talking about. And he wrote, the success of a society is to be evaluated primarily by the freedoms that members of that society enjoy. So if we want a new equation for society, one that encompasses what we believe in, what gives us meaning, it has to be developed with human agency in mind. Moving away from a paternalistic approach, here's a solution to problems that we haven't even fully understood that you might be facing, to recognizing that global society is diverse and complex, and that's a wonderful thing. But by making sure that you have a degree of ownership over your own outcomes, you will be able to decide how machine learning and AI can be used for you. So what can we do, all of us do about this? So I work for a public service organization. The BBC is a media organization. It informs, educates, and entertains. That's what it does. It's not how it does it. How it does it is by always trying to put the audience member, the citizen, the individual at heart, trying to remember what's in their interest. And by doing that, it's grown a reputation for being trustworthy. It's been able to make some differences. And a number of different institutions who are in the public service domain also do this. But you don't have to be a public service institution to work in service of the public. So everyone who's here at Catapult, we've already made that first step. We've already thought about the impact we want to make. We've tried to find our tribe, try to find the cliques and the groups that we want to belong to. But we're quite small. Our overall mission really needs to be, well, how do we start to imbue a sense of service of the public into everything that we're doing, and start to shift the wider world away from thinking about how economic incentives alone will define success for humanity. They won't. They're an important consideration and a really important part. But if we don't create a world which has balance, then we won't have a fair society. If we don't create one where we are giving people ownership over their own lives, we won't have a fair society. I'm out of time, but I'll just take a minute, if you'll give it to me, just to share one final anecdote about my dad. Right? So I work for the BBC. It's a globally recognized brand, right? Anywhere I go in the world, I say I'm from the BBC. Firstly, they assume I'm a journalist. I'm not. But normally, they're willing to have a conversation with me, doors open. And I've been really privileged and humbled that over the last few months, I've been asked by UK Parliament to input on the BBC's behalf into the development of AI, so policy setting, really looking at this consideration. And walking into that seat of democracy, UK Parliament, was a really proud moment for me in my career. I told my family about it, I told my friends about it. But my dad had beaten me to it by about 30 years. Because being a bus conductor, or then the thing he did after that, which was to own 2 restaurants, being a businessman, that was his side hustle. What he really cared about was civic action. He cared about creating a society in Sheffield which flourished, so he worked with the local councillors. He had my sisters folding up campaign leaflets for the Labour Party. He brought together the Muslim and Pakistani communities with other communities in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But he also still cared about what happened in Pakistan, thousands of miles away. And he worked tirelessly as part of the team that helped Pakistan's first female Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto, get elected. So when she came to the UK, my dad was part of the delegation that walked in through number 10 Downing Street to meet with the Prime Minister. He'd beaten me to it by 30 years. But he did that with a lot less education than I have, none of the access of free education that the UK provided me, a lot less luck than I have, a lot less inherited privilege than I have. And I just wonder, if luck was taken out of the equation, if where you start in life and who you know was either taken out of the equation or made more fairer, what else could he have achieved? And I hope to have kids one day, but I have lots of nieces and nephews. And when I look at them and when I think what their lives will be like, I hope that they don't have to rely on luck or who they know or where they live. And even worse than that, I think globally, there's such inequality. We live in developed societies, and already there's such stratification. We need to work really hard if we want to reduce inequality to take these factors away. Thank you.